Good evening. It's Wednesday, October 21st, 2020. My name is Greg Circle, the preacher for the Church of Christ that meets in Palmyra, Indiana. And I want to welcome you today to Bible Study How, our midweek Bible study for our church while we are in this COVID season. As we continue to try to study God's Word together during this time when we have to be socially distant. So I guess we can call this a socially distant Bible study. And again, I'm Greg Circle, the preacher for the Church of Christ. And sorry I'm running a bit late, but as you can tell from the camera, I'm having a little bit of trouble with it. And probably the audio is a little bit different, a little bit problematic. I'm just having a whole lot of technical difficulties, but we're going to go ahead with it today, and we're going to continue our study of the book of Ephesians in chapter 5. We're going to start in verse 22, and we are going to we're going to definitely get through chapter 6 and verse 9 today, but it may be possible that we can get through. I've only got 3 slides, of course, especially when we get verses 10 through 17. There's in chapter 6, there's a whole lot of information to talk about there, so we might slow down a little bit, get bogged down, but that's a good place to get bogged down in, I think. So we will we'll definitely get through chapter 6 and verse 9 today. We might want to remind ourselves of what we're studying. We're studying the book of Ephesians and what Paul had said just prior to this verse. So let's go back to chapter 5, verses 15 through 21. And there, Paul says to the Ephesian Christians, "Therefore be careful how you walk, not as unwise men, but as wise, making the most of your time because the days are evil. So then do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is. And do not get drunk with wine, for that is dissipation, but be filled with the Spirit, speaking to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody in your heart to the Lord, always giving thanks for all things in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ to God, even the Father." And here's the key part that we're going to look at. We're going to continue the thought of today. Be subject to one another in the fear of Christ. Be subject to one another. So that's kind of the point that Paul is going to continue on this evening, or in this chapter, as he finishes up chapter 5 and goes on into chapter 6. How can we be subject to one another? And so he's going to give us a couple of ways in verses 22 through 33 as he ends the chapter. We might stop and talk about this in individual chunks, but here we go. "Wives, be subject to your own husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is head of the wife, as Christ also is head of the church, he himself being the Savior of the body. But as the church is subject to Christ, so also the wives ought to be to their husbands in everything." And, this is, of course, in our time, a very difficult verse because I think perhaps some people look in this verse and see something that bothers their modern sensibilities, or perhaps it's been because in the past this verse has been misused for unscriptural reasons or to commit unscriptural behaviors. But keep in mind, Paul said in verse 21, "And be subject to one another in the fear of Christ." And so when we start out here, Paul first starts out, "Wives, be subject to your own husbands." And that is something that is the scriptural arrangement of the family, that it is the husband who is supposed to lead the family, and the wife is to be subject to him. And again, in our society in this day, when we're what's the word I'm looking for? We're looking for more equitability, egalitarianism. In our egalitarian society, that's the word I'm looking for. In our egalitarian manners, in our egalitarian systems that we have set up, we kind of view this as, not not right. That there's no sense in the wife being subject to the husband. That word "subject" is really a problematic word in today's standards. But what does it mean to Paul? What is Paul saying here? Well, he is saying that there is a hierarchy, just as there's a hierarchy of Jesus over the church. There's a hierarchy of the husband over the family, and the wife being part of the family. Be subject to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is head of the wife, as Christ also is head of the church. But when we look at the complementarian view, which is the view that I hold, that men and women are different and they complement each other. They're equal in a sense, but at the same time, there's certain roles that women fill better than men, and wives fill out those roles better than husbands. There is a difference, and that's the way God made us. He made us so that there was leadership. Man was created first. And if you go to another place where Paul talks about this idea of wives being subject to their husbands, he goes back to the very beginning. It's not a cultural thing. It's a matter of the order of creation. Now, what some may have done to this verse and said that we rule over our wives with an iron thumb or an iron fist, that's incorrect because of what Paul says in the next verse. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for her, so that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, that he might present to himself the church in all her glory, having no spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she would be holy and blameless. So husbands ought also to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his own wife loves himself, for no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ also does the church, because we are members of his body. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and shall be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is great. I'll stop there for a second. So he goes back to the very beginning, and he talks about what God says in the very beginning, that he created woman out of the rib of the man to be his helper, and the two become one. They become one unit. They unify, and they become one flesh. They become one body in more than one sense. And so for that reason, because the wife is a part of the husband, he takes the wife in, traditionally speaking, but let's look at it that way. He takes the wife in and accepts her as part of himself. And if she were to leave in one way or another, she takes a part of him with her, Yeah, I said that right. She takes a part of him with her, and vice versa the other way. I guess that's a redundancy. If he ever leaves one way or another, he takes part of her with him. And they do become one. They become a single unit. A unit who, for the raising of a family. At least that's... And I know raising of a family is not the only thing that a marriage does. That's not to say that, I'm not trying to say that if you don't have children, you're not fulfilling your biblical obligations. Let's not go that far. But let's say this, that, that's one of the things that a family does, that a husband and wife does. One of the things they do is strengthen society, strengthen the economy, and I use economy in a very broad way there. They strengthen society and the economy by teaming up and being one, being unified. And whether that unity is in business or in the raising of children, the raising of a family, they become one and they strengthen society because of that. But when you have two human beings, there's always, especially when you have two, when you have an even number especially, but two human beings, you're not going to agree on everything. You are your own person in a sense. And so there has to be this one that's ever so slightly above the other, that has authority. And that's what God has given to the husband, authority. But he also tells us, Paul also tells us here that, even though the wife is subject to the husband, in a sense, the husband is also subject to the wife. He is responsible to love her and care for her and cherish her and just be that support that she needs. Well, she supports him, he supports her, and the family is strengthened by that. Now, one of the things that we'll see here, that we'll ask, is hang on, my it just crashed on me. Let me see if I can get that back. I'll be back after this technical difficulty is resolved. Okay, so we'll just have to go without the presentation this morning or this evening. The presentation slides, but we will kind of need those to. All right, let's try this again. Here we go. All right, so we're talking about being subject to one another. Sorry about the technical delay, but I mentioned it earlier. I'm just having a bunch of technical difficulties today, I guess. But he's talking about husbands and wives being subject to one another. That's, he's, again, verse 21 of chapter 5, he's talked about Christians needing to be subject to one another in the fear of Christ. And he begins speaking about husbands and wives. But what is he really talking about in verse 32? Why are we subject to one another? He says in the fear of Christ a little earlier, but let's also continue with what he says. This mystery is great, but I am speaking with reference to Christ and his church. And so he mentions there that, he's really talking about the church is to be subject to Christ as a wife is subject to her husband. But I want you to notice what he says next, that the principle still applies. If we continue on in what he says, nevertheless, each individual among you also is to love his own wife, even as himself, and the wife must see to it that she respects her husband. She is subject to her husband and respects his place as the one who is just that slight step above. Of course, he also, and again, I can't reiterate enough, I can't reinforce enough the fact that the husband must love his wife. And again, the reason why we have this biblical mandate for the hierarchical structure of the family is because of, I guess what follows in Ephesians chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. Because, again, like I said earlier, it's all about, one of the main things that a family does, that a husband and wife does, is raise a family. They become the initial family unit, and that family unit expands through birth or adoption or whatever other ways that it might expand. And by taking care of those who are dependent on them. And so the next thing that Paul deals with is that extension of the family, and namely children. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may be well with you and that you may live long on the earth. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Now, we're going to, there again, just like in the previous passage, in the previous paragraph, he deals with the two-way relationship, the husband and the wife. Now he's dealing with the children, and he specifically mentions fathers, but I suppose, it's kind of a funny thing, I think, that we do as humans. He specifically mentions the fathers, but he probably means both parents. But if you think about it, I've mentioned it before, and I kind of played on it a little bit, trying to reverse it this year for the Mother's Day and Father's Day sermons. But Mother's Day, we get 100 reasons why you're a great mother. And for Father's Day, we get 100 ways you can be a better dad. And we talk about we joke about the oafishness of the dad. Moms get jewelry and all these wonderful gifts for Mother's Day. Dads get a tie, which, speaking as a dad, I'm perfectly fine with. But then again, my love language is not, gifting. So we'll have that. But we'll talk more about why fathers only in a little bit. But we need to talk about this idea of the relationship between children and parents. And children are to be subject to their parents. Honor your father and mother. And Paul goes in and talks about the promise that he goes back to the Old Testament for this command. He says, honor your father and mother. It's one of the 10 commandments. For this is the first commandment with promise. And the question is, what is the promise? And he mentions the promise. He tells us what the promise is. That you may be well, or that it may be well with you, and that you may live long on the earth. The promise, and I've mentioned this in a couple of sermons, and one recently, the promise was to the nation of Israel that their nation would last long on the earth, would live long on the earth. That if they listened, if the children obeyed their parents in the Lord, if they followed what their parents were teaching them, or at least what their parents were supposed to be teaching them, then they would have gotten all these great promises that God had given the Israelites. But as it turns out, just as children are apt to do, some to a greater extreme than others, they rebelled against their parents, and they did not honor their mother and father. And what happened? Idolatry entered into the land. Idolatry entered into the temple of God, and it caused it caused the kingdom to split, first of all. 10 tribes go to the north under Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin. And 2 tribes go to the south under Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, who wasn't much better. Go through the history of the southern kingdom of Judah, maybe 3 good kings. Go through the history of the northern kingdom of Israel, the 10 tribes, no good kings. The problem was they did not heed what God was saying. They were not obeying their parents in the Lord. And so what happened? Their nation was taken from them. Fast forward to today, when we have to make this application to the church. Because remember, go back up to the end of chapter 5, Paul is saying, verse 32, this mystery is great, but I'm speaking with reference to Christ and the church. And there he's talking about the husband and the wife, and the way the wife is subject to the husband, the church is subject to Christ. Well, the same way could be said for the father-son relationship, that we are subject to our Father. We are subject to our God. And we ought to honor Him. But again, just like before, there's the principle of, the principle that Paul is teaching here, that children ought to obey their parents in the Lord. For this is right. For in it, which is the first commandment with promise, honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, so that it may be well with you and that you may live long on the earth. Well, he might be talking about the church here as well. That if our children grow up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, if they obey their parents in the Lord, then they will be the next generation that carries the church through these troubling years that may occur. Certainly, they're going to face their challenges just as we have faced ours. And as long as we give them that foundation, they will be the ones who carry the gospel to the next generation, to their children. And as long as that pattern continues of children obeying their parents in the Lord, for this is right, then the church will continue and grow. And even if we look at it in more of a physical light, if we look at it more in the relationship of the children and parents, the name of the family continues, so that so that may be well with you and that you may live long on the earth. It's not so that I will live long, and the better my children are, the longer I get to live, although it probably helps a little bit. It doesn't hurt. An obedient child, an obedient son is probably a little less stressful, right? But anyway, I'm getting onto a tangent. But then he says, fathers, and again, he turns it around onto the fathers. He turns it around onto the parents. Do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Well, the question that we might ask there is, anger against what? Do not provoke your children to anger. Anger against what? Now, some, especially in our time, and we probably see this perhaps in our schools, we don't want to upset our children. We don't want them to be angry with us. We don't want them to, we don't want to provoke them to anger. Anger against what? Well, anger against me. But I don't think that's what Paul is saying here. And I think maybe I got the wrong interrogative pronoun on that. Anger against whom? Maybe the better interrogative pronoun. And that anger is against God. Fathers, Do not provoke your children to anger against God, or if it is what, against the gospel or against the church. Don't anger your children. Don't push them away. Now, sometimes you can do everything in your power to teach your children the gospel, to bring them to church, to encourage them to grow in the grace and knowledge of the Lord, in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. But eventually they become their own man, their own woman. They become an individual. Well, they're always an individual, I guess, but they become outside of your jurisdiction, as they might see it. And while they probably are in a better place because of you, they have chosen to leave. And that's something that we can't control. That's on them once they get to that point. But Paul says, be subject to one another. Fathers, yes, your children are subject to you, but also you have to be subject to them, and you have to build them up, bring them up in the nurture and admonition, or as the New American Standard says, discipline and instruction of the Lord. And so, do not provoke your children to anger. Anger against whom? Well, I think it's right there. Anger against the Lord. Instead of making them angry at the Lord, build them up and bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. And then finally, we keep in mind that the churches, when we look at churches, especially in rural areas, we see family churches. I've been in places where, it's been one family, maybe two families. And that's all there was. I think here in Palmyra, we've got several families. We got people who've come from outside of, a few families who are a part of this congregation. And it helps us to be stronger. We're not all a part of the same, genealogy. But, in a lot of especially rural churches, it is maybe two families. And look back in the first century, and you may have that same situation. Look at the case of Cornelius in Acts chapter 10. Look at the case of the Philippian jailer. They were men leading their families, listening to the gospel, and they and their households were saved. And so the church there was a church in Cornelius' house, and it was his household. But you got to also keep in mind that there was another part of the household back then, and it's something that maybe we have felt in the past, but we've kind of lost a little bit. Now keep in mind, I'm going to use the biblical terminology here as we read the scriptures, but we'll make an application today. Slaves and masters. Those are words that I don't know that we like to hear, but it is what it is. It's what the Bible uses because that's what they had then. We'll start by reading 5 through 8 of Ephesians chapter 6, where Paul says, "Slaves, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling in the sincerity of your heart, as to Christ, not by way of eye service as men pleasers, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. With good will render service as to the Lord, and not to men, knowing that whatever good thing each one does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether slave or free." Now, looking at those words, slaves and masters, yes, and especially in our time right now, we're revisiting those words in the historical context of America, and it's not real pretty. It's not real pretty to think about that relationship. But if you go back to the first century when Paul was writing, the slaves were a part of the household. They were household workers, and that was what their economy was based on. And you might even argue that our economy was based on that. As sad as it may be, as wrong as it may be, our economy was based on that up till the mid-1800s. But again, Paul's point is to Christians, be subject to one another, and in this case, slaves, be obedient to those who are your masters, according to the flesh, those who who are there to make sure you do the work that you have been hired. That might not be the right word, but that's the word we're going to use because I think that's the application to today. Hired, the work that you're hired to do. And you ought to do it sincerely. You ought to do it because you are a servant of Christ, not because you're a servant of that man, that human, but because you are a servant of Christ and of God. And so he says that, don't do it just to please men. Don't do it just to look good, but do it because you are honestly wanting to do your best. And whatever good thing each one does, even though you might not be rewarded for that good thing today, or even in 2 weeks, or even in 2 years, you're going to be rewarded for that good thing. And again, well, I don't know about again, but the good, who knows what good is? Who can tell you what good is? God will determine what good is, or he has determined what good is. And then if we go on to Ephesians chapter 6 and, well, I guess it's just verse 9. Just verse 9. Paul says, "And masters, do the same things to them, and give up threatening, knowing that both their master and yours is in heaven, and there's no partiality with them." Keep in mind, going back to Cornelius, that he and his household obeyed the gospel and were baptized into Jesus Christ for the remission of their sins. Now, I know some people say, "Ooh, babies." No, the household that was subject to that. We don't know for sure there were babies in the household, but that's another topic. We'll get into infant baptism perhaps at another time. But Cornelius' household probably included those who were in his employ, those who were his slaves. He was the owner of probably several, maybe many. And so the church in Cornelius' household, the church that was Cornelius' household, the church that included Cornelius' household, was made up in part of that relationship of master and slave. And so continue that on into when Paul is speaking to Ephesus, and that pattern probably continued. In the churches, there were employers and employees, and they were to be subject to one another. The employees subject to the employers. Well, do what you do with anything that you find to do, whatever your hands find to do it with all your might. I think that's in Solomon's writings. But also, just like he did with the wives and the husbands, just like he did with the children and the fathers, slaves and masters, employees, employers, there's that relationship that needs to be built up, and the employers, the masters, also need to subject themselves to their servants, to their slaves, to their employees. Do the same things to them. The idea is, well, what is it that he told the slaves to do? Be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh with fear and trembling and sincerity of heart as to Christ, not by way of eye service as men pleasers, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. With good will, render service as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that whatever good thing each one does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether slave or free. And masters, do the same thing. Do the same thing. Support your slaves. Support those in your employ. And then he gives the next step, and probably the more applicable to those who are employers or slave owners or masters. Give up threatening, knowing that both their master and yours. So just like the centurion, I think it was a centurion that came to Jesus. He said, "I'm over some and I am under some." In this hierarchy of the military, of the Roman army. Well, masters need to realize that no matter how high they are on the ladder, there's still someone above them. They still have a master. especially if they are a Christian. And yours, that he says, is in heaven, and there's no partiality with him. So he doesn't care if, your slave is doing exactly what he needs to do. If you put yourself under Jesus, if you put yourself under God, then you have to do what is loving to your slave. And sometimes, I think, just as with children, that might include discipline. That might include instruction, and especially discipline and instruction of the Lord. But that's, I think that might be part of the lesson here as well. But also, I think, just as we looked at the illustration that Paul uses, he uses of the husband and wives, Christ and the church. Fathers and sons, Father, our Heavenly Father, and we, his spiritual sons, the God of heaven and the church, the Father and the church. And then we've got the slaves and masters, or masters and slaves. Well, God is our master, and we are his servants. So I think in all these cases, maybe the mystery of chapter 5, verse 32 still applies. This is a great mystery, Paul says, but I am speaking with reference to Christ and the church. So I think maybe in all of these, he's speaking of the church. So, and again, what's the point of the book of Ephesians? The church of the Christ. The emphasis is on the church and how we ought to be. And so, just like he says at the start of this section, in the end of chapter 5, middle chapter 5, verse 21, be subject to one another in the fear of Christ. So, and he then gives examples of how we are to do it, but also makes that application to our relationship to God. All right. Well, I said we might get through Ephesians today, but that's not going to happen. We'll definitely get through 10 through 17 next Wednesday evening. And then, there's probably enough that we can go through 10 through 17, and it'll take all night. So we'll probably be done with this in about 2 more weeks. So if you want to go ahead and send emails or give me a phone call or message on either this video or somewhere on the Facebook page, what would you like to study next? Is there a book of the Bible you want to study next, or maybe a topic? If you'd rather do a topical study of something, let me have some ideas, and we'll consider those over the next couple of weeks, and that's what we'll start after we're done with the book of Ephesians, which is coming up pretty quickly, isn't it? So let's go ahead and close out. Again, as we always say, we invite you to our morning and evening worship services here at the church building at 10 a.m. and 5 p.m. on Sundays. Here's the address, 14175 Green Street Northeast in Palmyra. If you're visiting in the area, or if you're living in the area, we'd love to see you. You can also contact us by phone. That's the office phone number. And just leave a message, 812-364-6215. And finally, you can email me at preacher@palmyrachurchofchrist.org. And again, you could see our Facebook page on facebook.com/palmyra.churchofchrist. All one word, Church of Christ. And And again, you can continue watching our YouTube channel, see our previous lessons, our previous Bible studies on the book of Ephesians. And I promise you that they're a little brighter than this one. Like I said at the beginning, the camera's give me a little trouble today, as was the audio, but hey, we got through it. And also the PowerPoint gave me problems too, the Impress file. But we got through it today, and we're thankful for your joining us, and we hope that you were encouraged and blessed in this study. So we look forward to seeing you next week as we continue the book of Ephesians, maybe concluded, although, like I said, I doubt it. So let's go ahead and have a prayer, and then we will be virtually dismissed.